The next option that we have is transparency. And what transparency is going to allow you to do is control the transparency of the hair through a gradient from the root to the tip. So in this case, by default, the gradient is black to a dark gray. Now, if we go 100% white, that's going to be 100% transparent to 100% opaque. If we render, you can see that with transparency checked off, we see 100% of the hair, so it's opaque at the bottom and it's opaque at the top. If we enable the transparency channel and render again, you'll see the hair appears significantly shorter, and that's because now all the tips of the hair are completely transparent. So you'll see the not transparent, and with the transparency gradient turned on. Now, to show this off even more, we can invert the knots on our gradient and render again. So in the case of the inverted gradient, you can now see that the roots start to become transparent, so we can see through them, whereas the tips are 100% opaque. Now we have an option for brightness, and this is going to control the brightness of the gradient across the entire hair. So the brightness set to 0% is just like saying the hair is 100% opaque. Set the brightness back to 100%. You have the option to invert, and so that's going to take whatever values you have here and invert them. You can also control the transparency of the hair through a shader or an image. So here we can see the hair with no transparency, and here we can see the hair with transparency driven by the noise shader. And you can see that definitely the tips are affected a lot, but even the roots, you can start seeing through the base of some of the roots there. Going back to the transparency channel, you can also adjust the blend mode. So you have the option of setting any of these values here to blend between the texture that you have with the gradient that you have. The next option that you have is for thickness. Now here you can enter in a thickness for the root as well as the tip of the hair, and it's going to blend between these two values in a linear fashion. So if we set the root to be 1 and the tip to be 0 and render, you'll see that we have very thick hairs at the base and they converge to a very sharp point. Now we also have some variation here, which is going to randomly add or subtract whatever we set in here from the root or the tip. So if we set this to say 0.5 inches and render again, you can definitely see that there is now some variation in the width of all of these hairs. Again, no variation, and with added variation. Next we have a curve that's going to allow you to control the thickness along the hair itself. So at the top of the curve we have 100%, and then we have from the root to the tip. If we change this curve, we can control the thickness from the root to the tip. Finally, you can also drive the thickness through a texture. So we can add a noise, and we'll just adjust some of the values here, and set this to UV space, as well as just add some more contrast with our clipping. We can zoom out a little bit, and if we render, you can see areas where the hairs seem to disappear, and that is because the thickness is being set to 0. Now, where there is some gradation, the hair thickness does change gradually. So if we just go back to the noise material that we created, and allow for a bit more variation there, and render again, we now have smoother transitions between the full thickness and the reduced thickness. After the thickness parameter, we have a parameter here to control the length of the hair. So again, with this enabled, it's now going to use these parameters with whatever style you have set for your hair. The first percentage is the overall length of the hair. So 100% is going to mean the hair is equal to 100% of the guide. 50% would be 50% of the guide, and so on. The variation is going to be plus or minus whatever you have set in the length here. Now, it's never going to go over 100%, so if you have 90% with a 20% variation, you're always going to stop at 100%. It's not going to go to 110. So for example, we can set the hair length to 50, the variation to 45. So with the length checked and set to 50% with quite a bit of variation, you can see that the hair that we get now looks fairly ragged. And that's because, for one, it's a lot shorter. If we take a look at just the default length, and then the length with variation. You then have a slider that allows you to control how much is going to be blended between the 100% length and whatever you have set here. So if we were to say only want 15 or 20% of this to come through, we can set that and then render again. So here you can see the result of the 15% blend. Here you can see 100% length. Here's the 45% variation with the 50% length, and then a 15% blend. So just jumping between the 100% and the 15, you can see that it makes a very subtle difference, because we're not getting much of the variation that we had set. Let's set the amount back to 100%. So we'll start by adding a noise, and let's just increase the size here. And we can also just clamp this down a little bit, and we'll render again. So after having let that render, you can now see that the length of the hair changes gradually with the material. So where we were getting 100% black, you'll see the length is set to 0, and then it's going to give you a nice smooth gradation between the 0 and your white values, which would be 100% of whatever you have set here. Similar to length, but completely different, is scale. It's best not to use these two parameters in conjunction with each other. You can, but there's not much of a point. Now the scale dialog looks very similar to the length. The big difference is with the scale you can go beyond 100%, whereas with the length you're limited to 100%. So when you're adjusting the scale of a hair, you're actually going to be adjusting the entire hair along with the style, whereas when you adjust the length, it's going to actually cut the hair off at a certain point along that guide. So let's enable the scale, and we'll set this to be maybe 200% with a 100% variation. Maybe that's going to be too strong, so we'll start with something like 30. We can then click on Render, and once that finishes up, you can see that the hairstyle is pretty well maintained. The hairs are just a lot bigger. And here we can see the style with no scale, and scale set to 200. Again, we have a slider for the amount that will allow you to blend between no scale and a percentage of whatever parameters you have set at the top here. You can also drive the scale through a texture, so we can add a noise, set this to a specific noise shader and UV 2D space. Let's go 300% and add a little bit of clipping on there, and then render. Now, much like with the length, you'll see that you do get something that looks like a smooth fall off, but it's not actually reducing the length of the hairs, it's taking the exact same styling and just shrinking that down. So if we go from the no scale and take a look at the scale, you'll see how it is increasing the size of those hairs.